On a cold and rainy day in 1971, the crew of a Northwest Orient Flight in Portland, Oregon welcomed passengers on board their flight bound for Seattle, Washington. Little did they know that they would soon find themselves in the middle of one of the greatest mysteries in FBI history. Hello everyone, today we are delving into one of my favorite unsolved cases that has stumped the FBI for over 50 years, fueled theories and searches across the nation, and even changed the way aircraft are built. The hijacking and robbery of Northwest Flight 305 by D.B. Cooper. I'll be going over the hijacking itself, the investigation that followed, including the suspects and theories about what happened, as well as some of the evidence that has come out more recently. And along the way, I'll probably nerd out a bunch because I've loved this story ever since I was a little kid, and if all that sounds good, we're gonna get into it, and thank you for watching. The day before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971, a nondescript man in his 40s wearing a black or brown suit, white shirt, thin black tie, black raincoat, and brown shoes approached the ticket counter for Northwest Orient Airlines in Portland and purchased a one-way ticket bound for Seattle. The man used the name Dan Cooper, which was written on the ticket. He then carried a thin black briefcase and brown paper bag onto Flight 305, where he sat in the very back seat and ordered a bourbon and 7-Up from flight attendant Florence Schaffner. The plane took off at 2:50 p.m., and about 10 minutes into the flight, Cooper passed a note to Schaffner, which she assumed to be his phone number, just trying to hit on her. She was used to this sort of thing and put the note in her purse without opening it, not really paying much mind to a potential lonely businessman. Cooper then leaned over to her and whispered, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." She opened the note, which said in all caps, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase, and I want you to sit by me." Quite a ballsy pickup line if that was his actual intention. Schaffner followed his request and sat next to him, asking to see the bomb. Cooper opened up the briefcase to reveal 8 red cylinders of dynamite hooked by wires to a large battery. Cooper closed the case and told Schaffner his demands, which she wrote down and took the note to the cockpit. While in the cockpit, she relayed the situation to the captain and the rest of the flight crew, one of which, flight attendant Tina McClough, went back to sit with Cooper and act as a contact between him and the rest of the crew for the remainder of the flight. The demands Cooper made were relayed to flight operations for Northwest by Captain William Scott. Cooper requests $200,000 in a knapsack by 5 p.m. He wants 2 front parachutes, 2 back parachutes. He wants the money in negotiable American currency. Yes, it turns out that this hijacking is not a terrorist attack, but a robbery. And you might be thinking, why would he want 4 total parachutes? Well, it's so he can take a hostage as a form of insurance and keep law enforcement from rushing the plane once it lands. He would also make later demands that refueling trucks meet the plane on the runway. All the passengers were to remain seated while McClough brought the money and the parachutes on board. And only after all of these demands were met would he allow the passengers to leave the plane. After receiving these demands, the president of Northwest agreed to pay the ransom, and the Seattle Police Department and FBI were notified via air traffic control. They instructed Scott to stall, keeping the plane in the air over Puget Sound for 2 hours and giving passengers the excuse of minor mechanical difficulties while the FBI and SPD scrambled to collect ransom money. And I don't know why, but I have this funny image in my head of dozens of FBI agents running around Seattle going to ATMs to withdraw as much money as they can, and one of them hits his withdrawal limit, slowing down the whole thing. In reality, all the money came from First National Bank of Seattle, and the reason it took so long was because the FBI recorded every single serial number in order to track any of the bills should they be used after the hijacking. And while the FBI and Seattle PD are scrambling to meet demands, Cooper is sitting back calmly in the back of the plane, smoking cigarettes and chatting with McClough. She asked him why he chose this flight. Perhaps he had some reason to specifically target Northwest. He laughed off this question and told her, "It's not because I have a grudge against your airline. It's just because I have a grudge." He continued by telling her that this flight simply suited his needs. What those needs were, we will find out later on. At one point during the flight, an unidentified passenger wearing a cowboy hat came to the back of the plane and asked for a magazine to read because he was bored. McClough took him to an area behind Cooper's seat and searched for magazines. After the passenger left and McClough returned to her seat, Cooper said to her, "If that's a Sky Marshal, I don't want any more of that." McClough informed Cooper that there were no Sky Marshals on this plane. At approximately 5:24 p.m., Captain Scott was informed by air traffic control that the parachutes and money had been delivered to the airport, and he was given permission by Cooper to land. The plane landed and parked on a partially lit runway where crews attached a stairway, and per Cooper's instructions, McClough left her seat and a short while later returned with the money. Cooper then inspected the money to ensure that it was free of dye packs or even fake bills or just unpainted paper wrapped in legitimate bills. While he was doing this, McClough joked, asking if she could have some of the money, at which point he pulled out a packet of bills and just handed it to her. This guy is like the chillest robber in history, I swear. After he handed her the money, which I'm assuming she didn't think he would, she handed it back to him, stating that their company policy forbid them from taking tips. And honestly, I don't think I've ever been that loyal to a company policy. Hell, I wasn't that loyal to the UCMJ when I was in the Navy. You force me to sit next to you while you have a Wile E. Coyote dynamite bomb and hold my plane hostage, I'm taking the money and never working that job again. Policy be damned. Cooper took the money back and allowed all the passengers to exit the plane. After they left, McClough took several more trips outside to retrieve the parachutes and brought them back to Cooper. He then became pretty frustrated that the money was not delivered in the knapsack he requested, so he took out a pocket knife and cut open one of the parachutes and stuffed the money inside the bag while he tied it up using the paracord. And while all this was going on, the fuel trucks were having a bit of an issue refueling the plane, making Cooper impatient and possibly concerned that they were stalling, which they may have been because a FAA representative requested to meet with Cooper face-to-face, which Cooper declined. While still waiting on the fueling process, Cooper delivered a flight plan to the remaining crew that hadn't left with the passengers. The flight plan stated that they would head southeast towards Mexico City and fly at the slowest possible speed with an unpressurized cabin at an elevation of only 10,000 feet. The crew agreed, but told him that this meant the plane couldn't make the full flight and would have to stop for another refueling. They ultimately agreed to land in Reno, Nevada for the refueling stop. Now, Cooper made another demand that was very specific to the type of aircraft they were flying. See, they were flying in a Boeing 727, which has this unique feature that you don't see on aircraft nowadays. It has a rear staircase that can be lowered in order to bring on passengers, crew, or supplies. Cooper was well aware of this feature and demanded that the aircraft take off with the stairs in the down position. The captain and officials from Northwest Airlines argued that they couldn't take off that way because it was unsafe, but Cooper simply responded that it could be done. Ultimately, Cooper compromised with them, allowing them to take off with the stairs up, and he would just lower them once the plane was in the air. He also demanded that McClough stay on board to further assist him as they took off. And at around 7:40 p.m., the flight took off towards Reno, Nevada. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper instructed McClough to lower the rear stairs, but she told him that she was scared that she would be sucked out of the plane, which, I mean, fair enough. I wouldn't be sucked out of a plane after being robbed either. Cooper decided against this, instead instructing her to make her way to the cockpit and not to return. In one final plea before she left, she begged him to take the bomb with him, and he promised that he would either take it or disarm it. And as she walked toward the cockpit, she turned and saw Cooper tying the money bag around his waist before continuing into the cockpit, where she would remain for the rest of the flight. This was the last time Cooper was ever seen. At approximately 8 p.m., the ears of everyone in the cockpit popped and a flashing warning light turned on to let them know that the rear stairs had been lowered. Throughout the process of lowering the stairs, the crew had been speaking with Cooper using an intercom, asking him if he needed help, which he declined. As the plane approached Reno a little before 11 p.m., they keyed back up on the intercom to ask Cooper to raise the stairs, but there's no response. They asked again and still nothing. At 11:02, the plane landed on the ground in Reno and was met by FBI agents, state troopers, and deputies who feared that approaching the aircraft would make Cooper detonate the bomb. Captain Scott searched through the plane and confirmed that Cooper was not on board, and after sweeping the plane for half an hour, the FBI bomb squad found no bomb. The skyjacking was over, but the investigation and theories were just beginning. Immediately, the FBI, as well as Seattle and Portland PD, started working the case. Who was Dan Cooper? Why had he done this? And most importantly, where had he gone? All of these questions, in fact, would prove very difficult to answer. Starting with the name, because it was the 1970s and flying on a plane was like getting on a bus or a really big taxi. You didn't have to show your ID, security was almost non-existent, and you could bring things like guns or knives onto planes pretty easily. Or, a bomb. Because of this fact, Dan Cooper might just be a completely fictional person, and the hijacker made up the name on the way to the airport. However, the best links to who he truly was were still in the aircraft. During the search of the plane, the FBI recovered a black clip-on tie, a tie clip, his ticket, 8 cigarette butts, and a hair from his headrest. After extensive searches for DNA and other materials, the FBI eventually placed most of these items into storage to hopefully be useful in a future date. The next important question on everyone's mind was, where did he go? Well, that's unfortunately not going to be easy to answer either, because Seattle to Reno is 563 miles if you're flying a straight line. That's a lot of ground to cover. And not only does the distance make this nearly impossible, there's also multiple different terrain features. You have the heavy forested areas of western Washington and Oregon, the higher mountains over central Oregon and northern Nevada, and then just straight up desert. So the FBI decided that they had to narrow down the search, and they believed he likely jumped within the first few minutes after lowering the stairs, putting his estimated landing area near the southern side of Mount St. Helens. Agents and local law enforcement searched the area, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover even authorized the use of the SR-71 Blackbird, the plane we made out of Russian titanium, go check out that video, to survey and take pictures of the area, searching for any clues to Cooper's whereabouts or to find the equipment he had been carrying. Unfortunately, all of these attempts to locate him turned up nothing, and the FBI left this search empty-handed. They would return several months later in March of 1972 to conduct another area search, and they thought they had a lead when a body was reported to have been found inside an abandoned building, but that was later identified as the body of a local murder victim, which to me is insane that you're looking for this hijacker only to stumble upon the evidence needed to solve another crime. And while all this investigating was going on, the FBI made press releases looking for information that could lead to the capture of Cooper. However, one journalist, probably in a hurry to get the first scoop, mistakenly wrote D.B. Cooper instead of Dan Cooper for the culprit's name, and that's what stuck, and we still use D.B. Cooper to refer to him to this day, even though it's never been correct. So the FBI currently has no physical evidence that is useful. Nothing has been found in the searches of the flight path or the suspected landing zone. I guess we have to figure out what this guy looks like. So the FBI sits down with Florence Schaffner and Tina McClough and several passengers to create sketches of what Cooper looked like, and they have some various takes. Iteration 3 ends up being the most agreed upon sketch and is the closest thing we have to what he likely looked like, and was the most widely released photo in the search for the hijacker. And the FBI also used the events of the hijacking, along with Cooper's demeanor, language, and temperament in order to build their profile, and this is what they came up with. Possibly military trained and familiar with parachuting, more specifically a US Air Force veteran due to knowing the location of the nearest Air Force base to the Seattle airport down to the mile, familiar with the region for the same reason, not likely a common criminal due to meticulous planning and calmness under pressure, and likely worked alone due to his ability to react to and adapt to situations as they arose. There was also a theory that he may have been French-Canadian due to his lack of accent, asking for money in negotiable American currency, and the fact that the name he gave, Dan Cooper, was also the name of an adventure comic about a military ace pilot that was popular in French Canada at the time. The FBI also assumed that Cooper was in some kind of financial trouble that had fueled his plan to hijack the plane, as people don't really take these kinds of risks unless they are truly desperate for a lot of cash really fast. Cooper himself also proved that he was intimately familiar with the setup and operation of the 727 due to his knowing that he could open the back stairs mid-flight and that the pilot could do nothing to override the action from the cockpit. This, paired with the directions that he gave the pilot, meant that Cooper knew the airspeed the plane was capable of flying without stalling. This helped fuel the idea that Cooper was a military veteran of the Vietnam War and possibly knew that the CIA had been using this specific aircraft to drop agents and supplies into areas of Laos and Cambodia. Oh, you didn't know that the CIA was using unmarked civilian aircraft to fly people and supplies into nations they weren't supposed to be in? Yeah, it's called Air America, and it was operated exclusively by the CIA for their covert operations in Asia from 1946 to 1976, and is just another great example of how much the government will do to cover their tracks when they're doing some shady shit. So we have our suspect profile, now it's time we start looking for suspects, and for that, I need a whiteboard. Now, before we get into this section, it should be noted that the FBI compiled a list of nearly 1,000 possible subjects, ranging from people with criminal pasts to deathbed confessions and people just wanting to have the spotlight. You know, the same kind of thing that happens with any famous unsolved case. But these men were considered by many to be the most likely suspects. Also, I took my jacket off because it's like 1,000 degrees in my house. The first suspect we have is Ted Braden, who was identified as a suspect due to several factors. Number one, he was a Special Forces member of MACV-SOG, the unit that was doing all the undercover operations in Laos and Cambodia during Vietnam. As such, he had a ton of jump experience and familiarity with the 727. Number three, he deserted his unit in Vietnam in 1966 to go be a mercenary in the Congo and was known to take extremely dangerous and often unnecessary risks. And his physical description was a pretty good match for Cooper, except that he was listed as 5'8" on his military record, which 2 inches is something that they could easily make up for just in the fact that Cooper was wearing shoes, and when you do your military physical, you're barefoot. Another prominent suspect was another Vietnam veteran, Richard McCoy Jr., who was suspected due to his history as a demolitions expert, a helicopter pilot, and the fact that he hijacked another plane in the exact same way. Well, not exactly the same. McCoy used what was later proven to be a paperweight disguised as a hand grenade and an unloaded pistol during his hijacking, and he asked for $500,000 instead of the $200,000 that Cooper demanded. McCoy also jumped out of the back of the stairs of the airplane, only he was over Provo, Utah, and left behind much more evidence, including a set of his own fingerprints. He was caught just 2 days after his hijacking on April 9th, 1972, and all but 30 of the $500,000 was recovered. He was eventually sentenced to 45 years in prison, but would escape just 2 years later after crashing a garbage truck through the main gate of the prison. He was then tracked down and killed in a police shootout just 3 months later. And thanks to some FOIA requests in 2020, it was revealed that he was an FBI suspect as late as 2004. And in 2024, McCoy's children said that they believed he was the real DB Cooper after finding a parachute that matched the specifications of Cooper's in a storage shed belonging to their mother. Vince Peterson was one of 8 engineers that worked at the now defunct Crucible Steel plant in Midland, Pennsylvania during the time of the hijacking. Now, what does a closed steel mill in Pennsylvania have to do with a plane hijacking in Seattle? It comes down to Cooper's tie that was discovered on board the plane. Thanks to a group called the Cooper Research Team, and with the use of some more advanced microscopic science, it was discovered that tiny particles of unalloyed titanium were embedded into the tie. Now, if you watched my video on the SR-71, you would remember that at this time, titanium was very difficult to come by, with only a handful of companies having access to the metal. And what did these companies do with that metal? That's right, they manufactured parts for the aircraft industry. And if you remember, the aircraft that Cooper hijacked was a Boeing 727. Now, if only there was a link between Boeing and Crucible Steel that could make Peterson a possible suspect. Oh wait, there is. Crucible Steel was one of the main manufacturers of titanium parts for Boeing at the time. Now, you match this information with the fact that Peterson does bear a fair physical resemblance to the sketches of Cooper, it makes sense why he has become a suspect for some people. However, the FBI, the people in charge of the investigation, have never listed Peterson as a suspect in the case. All the information I just gave you comes from independent researchers. Now, which of these subjects do I think is the hijacker? Well, none of them. I don't think any of the suspects that have been put up by the FBI or the public are convincing enough to actually be Dan Cooper. Ted Braden doesn't seem like the kind of guy that would be hijacking planes in order to make money when he already knows that he could go be a mercenary and make money doing the same things he was doing for McVie-Sog in the 60s. And I think we can rule out McCoy due to him being much more sloppy in his execution of his own hijacking, leaving fingerprints and other evidence, as well as being caught just 2 days later. I just don't think that that really adds up. Also, them finding a parachute that matched Cooper's in the family storage unit doesn't really add much in my opinion, simply because there are a lot of parachutes around the world, especially during the Vietnam War, that would have matched that description. And Vince Peterson is purely based on the fact that he was exposed to material that was found on Cooper's tie. No matter how rare the material is, it's not enough to place someone as a viable suspect. And that leads me to the theories. So if we've ruled out the listed suspects and whoever Dan Cooper was remains a mystery, then what led him to making this jump, and what happened to him afterwards? As to why Cooper undertook the heist, there are several theories that I find interesting. Number one is the idea that he needed to pay off a massive debt, and quickly. This was one of the possible motives listed by the FBI in their profiling, and it could make some sense. While it's true that criminals don't often undertake such large, risky crimes unless it's a truly desperate situation, there are outliers to this theory, like David Gant, the guy who stole $17.3 million to win over a woman he had a crush on. I still can't believe that that story is real. Anyway, this is a fine theory with motives ranging from gambling debts and loan sharks to losing his job and just becoming desperate. Which honestly would also line up a bit with what Cooper said to McClough when he said that he had a grudge but didn't go into any details. Maybe he had a grudge against a former employer that fired him and thought this would be a good way to make some money quick. One of my favorite theories behind the motivation of the heist was that he was terminally ill and wanted to make sure his family was taken care of. This theory could easily explain why he would undertake such a risky move. Maybe he thought he was running out of time and this was the only way to care for his family, which maybe wasn't a bad plan considering the equivalent in 2026 is roughly $1.6 million. This theory has also been fueled by a manifesto that was sent to several papers in the few weeks following the heist, claiming to be Cooper. The letter stated that there was no way the FBI could catch him due to him wearing a disguise that included a toupee and face putty. It also stated that he only had 14 months to live and had undertaken the crime simply to ease his final days on Earth. To me, is a pretty compelling theory. However, I think it romanticizes the situation a little bit too much. And I would also think that the people sitting right next to him would have been able to notice that he was wearing face putty and a toupee. I mean, there's good ones out there, but I still think it would be noticeable. But back to the romanticization of this, the FBI stated that they were pretty skeptical that Cooper even survived the initial jump, and with pretty good reason. He was jumping into a moonless, pitch black night in the rain wearing a suit, loafers, and a raincoat. It would be cold to wear those things at ground level in those conditions, but he was jumping from 10,000 feet. It was 15 degrees, and the wind from both the aircraft and the elevation was roughly 170 miles per hour. There's a chance that he didn't even get his chute open and froze before he ever hit the ground. And even if he made it to the ground, the clothing he was wearing was not suitable for survival in the woods for any period of time. As anyone who has spent any time camping in the woods or spending long periods of time in the wilderness, if you get wet and can't get dry, you're probably going to die. Even if Cooper survived the initial jump and landing in his dress shoes, it would likely be that he would freeze to death before making it back to civilization. What do I ultimately think happened to DB Cooper? I have two theories. The first is less fun, but is fueled by all the evidence I laid out just a minute ago, and the fact that in 1980, an 8-year-old hiker discovered $5,800 of the ransom money on the beach of the Columbia River just outside of Vancouver, Washington. The money was heavily degraded due to the elements, but still had the rubber bands holding it together. My less fun theory is that Cooper never even opened his parachute. He just crashed into the Columbia River where he drowned, some of the money coming out of the bag on impact, and was buried in the sand while his body was taken down the river, never to be found. But my more fun theory is that Cooper buried the money sometime after the heist to throw off investigators, and then made his way down to Mexico, where he spent the rest of his life and was probably one of the old guys I saw there on my honeymoon. And I know that the pushback against that theory is that none of the money ever went back into circulation, and like, okay, maybe it just stayed down in Mexico. They don't track their money anywhere close to how we do, let alone our own money. Or maybe they just laundered it and it went into the drug cartels down there and he made a deal with them that it would only be used for criminal organizations. Stop trying to ruin my dreams. That is the story of DB Cooper, the only unsolved hijacking of a plane in United States history, and one of, if not the most famous unsolved cases in FBI history, and a story that I have loved since I was probably 10 years old. Maybe thanks to my sister and I watching Without a Paddle a ton when we were growing up, or the fact that it's just a really, really cool story. But I also want to make sure that people know that I do not think that this guy is a hero or anything like that. He threatened to blow up a plane full of innocent people in order to steal money from the company that owned the plane. He's not a good dude, just a fascinating one. Also, my wife lived in Seattle for several years and had no idea who DB Cooper was. Is he just not a thing that people talk about in that area anymore? I figured he would have some significance on the culture there. Who knows, maybe Sky King just took all the popularity that Cooper once had since he was way more recent. Oh shoot, and that reminds me, the way that he changed aviation was after the DB Cooper and the McCoy hijacking, the 727 had to change how they were built. They installed a piece of material, basically just a lever on the back opening of the rear stairs that once it reached airspeed would lock into place so that it couldn't be opened while in flight, and nobody would ever be able to repeat this kind of hijacking ever again. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you stuck around this long, please let me know some of the theories about the hijacking that you think are most likely, or if there's a suspect that I didn't mention that you think was actually Cooper. And do you think he made it, or do you think he died 30 seconds after he jumped, and the last 50 years of investigation have just been a waste of time and money that the government stole from you and probably could have spent on solving more pressing crimes? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video, but until then, go live a story worth telling. The end.